BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Hello and welcome to the Farming Today podcast with me, Charlotte Smith. In this episode, we talk seasonal workers and life-changing moments.
I'd sort of had this epiphany in the hospital when I was praying for Job to live. As a farmer, I was killing so much stuff. You know, the thing that healed my whole life and my brain and put me the smile on my face is this regenerative agriculture. It regenerates everything, and including your mind.
Let's start then with farm staff. With few British people wanting to pick fruit and veg, for many, many years now, workers have come from abroad to work the season. It's been something of a vexed issue, with complaints about the way the system works and the number of people allowed to use it, as well as concerns about the exploitation of workers. Well, all this week we've been looking at labour on farms, so today let's look at this aspect of it. After Brexit, a new seasonal workers scheme, now a seasonal workers visa, was introduced. The government's confirmed that next year 43,000 such visas will be available for people in horticulture, with a further 2,000 for the poultry industry. Now, the visas are organised via recruitment agencies which are licensed to supply workers. One of them is Proforce. Bob Huckenhull has been to meet regional manager Rob Hull at one of their customers, a broccoli grower in the Midlands.
What are the main challenges of finding the right workers with the right skills?
I think the key is working in partnership with the client. Everybody's got different demands. You know, we spend a lot of time in country, for example, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Kenya, interviewing, and then when here, the induction process is absolutely key to make sure we've got the right fit.
And do many of the workers come back? I know they're allowed to stay here 6 months. Do they come back the year after and the year after?
We'd always look for returnee rates across any business we work with at between 60 and 80%.
There are looming changes troubling farmers, though. Migrant seasonal workers currently pay for their visas and travel costs from abroad. But it's proposed farmers and growers will now meet these costs. Caroline Green, co-owner of AS Green, says this will have a damaging impact.
That's a huge cost, and also we feel we pay very, very competitive wages. There's an opportunity to earn well above minimum wage, more than enough to cover the cost of their travel and visa whilst they're here.
If you have to pay for that, how much is it going to cost you and what are the implications?
We have workers from as far as Kenya, and the cost could be as much as £2,000 per employee. Therefore, we would have to seek more value for our product, and therefore that could mean costs in the supermarkets could rise.
Another big topic is, of course, the welfare of these workers. How do you ensure your workers are living and working in good conditions?
We are regularly audited by our labour providers. We follow all the legislation that's in place, and we also make sure when workers arrive, we ask them questions and we make sure they haven't been exploited and paid over and above the cost of coming, because we know the exploitation can be in their own country.
Is there pressure on workers not to complain because they want a job?
There used to be. I would actually say now the workers are much more aware. And the workers know if they have a problem, we get it sorted for them.
That's certainly something one member of staff at AS Green agrees with. Kaloyan Stoimanov first came over from Bulgaria as a seasonal worker 19 years ago. He's worked his way up and is now a manager living here permanently.
Everything is more easy and more understandable for people which don't talk in English, for example, and everything else.
And do you think the conditions are better now?
Yes, I think they changed. They changed much better. You know, everything is. In 2005, you was paying everything around. Now the farmer is helping, so you don't pay, for example, gas or electricity. This is paid from the farmer, which is quite good for the people, you know. And this is just a good money for them saving, you know.
Kaloyan Stoimanov there. Well, that is the experience of one person on one farm in the Midlands. So let's broaden this out a bit. DEFRA has recently published the results of its latest survey of seasonal workers. Last year, 91% reported a positive experience and 95% expressed a desire to return, both figures up from the year before. But there were complaints, particularly about poor accommodation. And while just 3% made a formal complaint, 10% said they had grievances they didn't report. Now, this has been an area of concern for a while. When you rely on the company that's brought you over, it can be hard to then complain to them. Dr. Natalie Sedacca, Assistant Professor in Employment Law at Durham University, spoke to migrant workers for her PhD.
Unfortunately, our research has found that the restrictive conditions of the seasonal worker visa, which has a short duration of only 6 months and limitations on changing employer, are actually fueling the risk of exploitation.
And when you say exploitation, what sorts of things are we talking about?
So one aspect of it is to do with the costs incurred to come to the UK. So additional charges like illegal recruitment fees being charged outside of the UK. And there can be issues with both long working hours, which some workers might choose, but it's obviously important that there's been a free choice to that and it's not kind of pressure because of this really short duration or these debts. And then on the other hand, there can be low hours, particularly during low season. So if you're given fewer hours than what was the minimum promise, that causes, again, a real problem with, can you recoup those costs? Also, the use of kind of dehumanizing language. 5 workers in a 3-room caravan, so you might have to share a room, sleep on a sofa, being required to use an outdoor toilet, broken appliances, those kind of issues.
Are there concerns too about how far people are coming now, both the cost of that and the practicalities of it? You mentioned Indonesia. We've also seen people coming from places like Kenya.
The reason it becomes an issue is because you pay so much money because you have to travel that distance. And then having travelled that distance, you only have a maximum of 6 months. You might not get the full 6 months. You might have a delay in starting. There might be less time. And then even worse is if there is not enough work. And in some cases, people being told you should go back early. It also became a concern for Indonesian workers that were in our interviews because many were told that they were paying once to then come for 2 seasons. So they'd come and they'd go back and they'd come again. But then the recruiter, the scheme operator that was responsible for those workers lost their licence, so they couldn't come the second time.
Farmers and growers are clear that they would like these visas to be longer. What changes did you recommend, having looked into all this?
Well, yeah, so interestingly, that's in some ways a synergy. So one of the changes that we did recommend is to allow extensions where a worker can secure a job for longer than 6 months or can secure an extension of their current role. We also said that it should be extendable is where the worker wants to start legal action or seek advice on employment matters. And that's because a lot of the way of enforcing labour rights here is based on, say, using employment tribunals. But in fact, if you're in the country for only 6 months, it's extremely difficult to do that. So that's one way, again, of redressing the balance. We also suggested recommending it to make it more viable in practice to change employers. So where there are indications of exploitation or breaches of employment law or accommodation standards, for example, but, just having more of a clear contact, having to provide written reasons for a refusal and so on.
Natalie Sedacca there. Now, just before we go, time for a shameless plug. For this Sunday's On Your Farm programme here on BBC Radio 4, I've been to meet the Taylor Davies family, who farm near Ross On Wye. This was a fairly usual cereals farm, which Ben Taylor Davies took on from his father, and he was running it in a fairly conventional way, until things changed radically.
It all came to a head back in 2012. I'd married my wife, Helen. We'd had 3 children. And we were doing all right. And then Helen was asked to load some horse jumps in a field and take them to a local show. And Job was strapped into the back seat of the car.
That's your son?
That's our son.
Who was how old at this point?
16 months.
Right.
And he had 2 Houdini clips, for those that recognise these things. They're special clips to stop children escaping out of car seats. He literally was a Houdini. Anyway, she was loading a couple of jumps and then she happened to look up and he'd broken out of the car and literally waddled about 20 metres away where there was a mare stood, and she lashed out and kicked him in the side of the head. I happened to be in the next door barn and heard these horrific screams of my wife, and she scooped him up and ran screaming, and we jumped in the car and rushed him down to hospital, our little community hospital, where it was fairly obvious things were extremely serious, and they got an air ambulance to airlift him straight off to Birmingham Children's Hospital. And essentially he'd lost nearly 60% of his brain. He was in a pretty bad state, and when your children are fighting for their lives in the hospital, I tell you, every second feels like a year. Cut an awful long story short, he pulled through. With huge brain damage and that sort of thing. That's where my brain damage started happening.
Really?
I had a total mental breakdown, basically, and just couldn't come to terms with having to say, self-blame, self-pity, self-harm, self-everything, if you know what I mean, and self-destruct more than anything. And I was in that state an awful long time, in actual fact.
So were you depressed? I mean, were you still farming, or were you... How did it...
Do you know what? I don't even know what I was doing. I didn't particularly like leaving the house because I felt I needed to be this protector of family kind of thing. Too late, obviously, really. I'd fallen out of love with farming for many reasons, but mainly I'd sort of had this epiphany in the hospital when I was praying for Job to live, and then realised that as a farmer I was killing so much stuff. With fungicides, pesticides, with all these things, I was a killer. How do you get your passion back for this farming? And well, the thing that healed my whole life and my brain and stood here talking to you with a smile on my face is this regenerative agriculture. It regenerates everything, and including your mind. And it was only eventually when Helen said, you need to pull yourself together, really. You've talked about doing a Nuffield scholarship in the past. You need to get a bit of passion back for something. Why don't you apply for one?
So for people who don't know, a Nuffield scholarship is where the organisation Nuffield will give you some money to go and travel and look at whatever farming subject it is you want to do all around the world so that you can learn something, bring something back.
Yeah, so I wrote an application, and I just hasten to add, I didn't actually want the Nuffield at the time. I was hoping they'd get rejected.
Was this just to appease Helen?
Yeah, really. I mean, can you imagine? I felt I couldn't barely leave the house, and there I was applying to travel the world. Big problems. Yeah. Anyway, I got it, and I decided to go to America and spend 6 weeks travelling, zigzagging the whole country. And it just so happened I met some of the most inspirational people almost immediately by accident. Fate, or whatever you call it. And the first person I happened to meet was Gabe Brown.
He's actually really famous in farming circles.
He is very famous.
A really big thinker, really a different approach to soil in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. And he showed me around his farm. I learnt about what I called from then on opposite farming.
Opposite farming?
Yeah. So this chap Gabe was doing the opposite of everything I was doing. First and foremost, he didn't talk about yields. He didn't talk about anything in particular other than soil. He said, you look after your soil and everything will come right. And he wasn't using any fertilisers, and he wasn't using any pesticides, and he kept talking about covering the soil and feeding the biology of your soil, and the soil should be alive. And yeah, just found it absolutely inspirational what he was saying. And well, that was that little chink of light changed everything.
Ben Taylor Davies, also known as Regen Ben. More from him and the rest of the family here on BBC Radio 4, Sunday morning at 6:30. That's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The producer is Beatrice Fenton, and Farming Today is a BBC Audio Bristol production.